Be here. We are in John chapter 9, looking at more of these questions Jesus asked. And let me pull up multiple versions here. I like to have that. I told you we'd get the context of this question today, and there's just one question in this chapter. By the way, I showed this as question number, it's cut off, it looks like 153 in my list. We've added a few here and there that I didn't have in the list. But all that just to say, I'm trying to remember exactly how many. I just looked at it Friday. But I can't remember the exact number, but it's under 200. I want to say it's like 169, 170, something like that, total questions. And I mention that just to say sometimes we only cover a question a week, so it could be a little while yet before we get to that point, but we're at least on the back end of this. I have another compilation. Both of these, at least the list of questions, were compiled by Reagan's dad, Roger Campbell, and he also compiled a list and taught through questions other people asked Jesus. We've been looking at questions Jesus asked, and of course to whom he addressed them, looking at the context and so on. But the other list is questions that humans asked of Jesus during his time here on this earth. So, just to mention that, because as we wind down, I don't know if we're going to end up landing on a quarter when we finish this. I don't know that it matters because these have each been kind of standalone lessons, anyways. But I don't really have an opinion either way. I mean, I've enjoyed this. I've enjoyed the kind of standalone lessons. I wouldn't mind going, whether it's a book, as in a book of the Bible, or a class book, or a topical study after this, or if folks in the class want to say, okay, well, let's keep the question theme going and look at some questions that other people asked of Jesus. I'm okay with that. So, be letting me know. But I'm kind of dependent on feedback from you all. Otherwise, I'll just do whatever I want to do. But the problem is right now I don't really have an opinion either way, because I could do either one. But we're in John chapter 9. But if you have any opinion on that, even in the slightest, maybe even just some feedback. You might say, hey, I don't really have an opinion on that necessarily, but here's some things to consider. Then please do share with me. If nothing else, just so I know somebody's out there and they're listening. All right, so John chapter 9. I mentioned this to you last week, I think, just kind of in sort of setting the stage for this, and I just realized I forgot to look this up, but it won't take me but just a second. I was thinking about this. I guess it would be a one-hit wonder. I don't know. I said it wouldn't take me long, but now I'm trying to think. What was this? Like early 2000s, maybe? There was a song that I think it was probably a one-hit wonder. I don't know anything else. I mean, I couldn't tell you anything else by this artist. But the song is. The artist's name is Daniel Powder, and the song is called Bad Day. And probably a lot of folks remember it. If nothing else, I remember it from, there was that television show where they'd have the singers come on, and what's that show? American Idol. Good grief, I couldn't even think of it. American Idol, and when they got, if they got voted off, then they would play this song one particular season at least, and it's just, you had a bad day. And I was thinking about it. I meant to look up the lyrics. I don't know that there's anything especially. I didn't even know the lyrics when I was sitting there thinking about it. It just crossed my mind this morning. But the chorus at least says, you had a bad day, you're taking one down, you sing a sad song just to turn it around. You say you don't know, you tell me don't lie, you work at a smile and you go for a ride. You had a bad day, the camera don't lie, you're coming back down and you really don't mind. You had a bad day. And it was just one of those songs that it kind of, I don't know if it was just because that television program used it or what, but I mean, I heard it a lot on the radio as well. And it just resonated with a lot of people because the tune, I think, was a lot of why. It just kind of had that sort of melancholy type tune that you would sort of think of in terms of if you had a bad day. I was just happy to think about that song this morning because when you get to John chapter 9, Jesus has really had a bad day. And we've all been there. We've all been there where you've had a just horrible, horrible day. I get tickled sometimes at my friend Hayner in Costa Rica because, of course, he's very good with his English as far as speaking and all that. But if he ever, sometimes when he really gets, it could be frustrated, it could be angry, it could be sort of sad, he'll throw in Spanish with the English. And that's how I can tell when he's really getting either aggravated or down. And sometimes he'll just, he maybe it's on a Marco Polo or something, and he'll say, today was just, I had this tough situation. I mean, it was horrible. And instead of just saying horrible in English, he'll say horrible. And it's funny to me because I've noticed that, and sometimes when I get aggravated about something now, and of course it doesn't really resonate with my family, but it's funny to me. If I get really aggravated about something, I might throw in horrible or whatever. But we've all been there. You had just a terrible day. Maybe you think you're going to come home to the one person or persons who's going to make you feel better, and maybe I don't know. Maybe they've had a bad day as well. Maybe they're just whatever. And I mean, it's just some days it feels like everything is going wrong, and I don't know that. Again, I mentioned this. I think it was last week. I did a study. It was just, I think Barry Gilreath Jr. he was our preacher at Highland when I was there in Dalton. I think he was out of town or something. I didn't have a whole lot of notice, maybe a day or two. He said, hey, I'm going to be out of town. Can you teach the adult auditorium class? Sure. Well, do you want me to just pick something or what? He said, yeah, just pick something. So I don't know what made me settle on this, but I wanted to teach about Jesus healing the blind man. And I wanted to get context. And because, as we often say, context matters. So I back up into chapter 8. And I mean, there's just this confrontation there in chapter 8. And so I back up some more, and there's this woman who is taken in adultery, and they bring her, and they're trying to trick Jesus. They're trying to get him to say something that they can use against him. And I'm kind of like, wow, okay. And and then you back up into chapter 7. And that really, I guess, would be kind of where the context begins. At the end of chapter 6, he's really been dealing with a lot in chapter 6. A lot of his disciples have turned and walked away there at the end of the chapter. You have Jesus turn to the 12. Will you also go away? And at least they stayed for that moment. Of course, Judas later is going to go away, and at his betrayal, they're at least going to flee. But Peter says, to whom shall we go? Thou hast the words of eternal life. But he's dealt with that in chapter 6. You get to chapter 7, you've got his brethren saying, oh, man, go up to the feast. Show everybody yourself. You want to be some big shot. And they don't believe on him, and they're kind of mocking him. Then he goes up to the feast, and people start kind of challenging him, and he's teaching, and you've got them at one point sending folks to arrest him. Of course, they come back empty-handed and say, "Never man spake like this man." But he's dealing with that there at this Feast of Tabernacles. And when you get to chapter 8, it really ramps up. We studied that the last few weeks. But when you get to chapter 9, Jesus is going to run across this. He's still there at the temple, and he passed by. As he passed by, he saw a man which was blind from birth. And I don't know what made me think about this several years ago, but it's kind of stuck with me. When I was studying for that lesson, I was thinking about how sometimes you have had a bad day, and especially maybe in full-time preaching work, you just had this really bad day. I've had it happen here. I mean, in almost 13 years I've been here, it's happened more than once. We're just having a tough day. Maybe I'm just, my mind is scattered all over the place, and I'm trying my best to, buckle myself down and get busy doing what I know I need to get done because I'm already behind, and I'm struggling with that. And I finally, I kind of get in that groove, and I'm just starting to get going, and there's like a knock on the door. And you go out there, and you can tell this is somebody they're looking for help. And they start telling you, explaining their situation, and can I just be honest? There have been times when I sat there and I'm just like, come on. And maybe even not necessarily as a preacher. I've been places before where we happen to be kind of in a downtown area or whatever, just having a rough day, and here comes somebody and they're looking for help. And I realize that a lot of times we don't have the miraculous insight that Jesus did to know when somebody's genuine, when they're not. I'm not suggesting we don't do our due diligence, as we sometimes say. I still say, I've said before, I would rather, I'm not saying I always am consistent with this, but I would rather err on the side of helping someone than not. I would rather get to heaven one day and hear the Lord say, "Well, good on you, Chad. You were striving to be like Jesus." Now, unfortunately, this guy was a complete liar, but you tried to do the right thing. You didn't know that. You helped him in good conscience. I'd rather hear that than to hear the Lord say, "Chad, that lady really was genuinely in need. And you just jumped to that conclusion and said, not going to help, not going to do anything." And I'm a little disappointed. I would far rather have the former than the latter. So, and again, that's not to say we should not do due diligence. And I've learned over the years different ways that help with that. At least it's not it's not foolproof, but anyway. But maybe you've been there where you've already had that bad day, and you're maybe in an area where sometimes there are folks that are out and they're asking for some money, and they say, "I'm homeless, anything helps," blah blah blah, and you're just like, I don't want to deal with this today. And here, he's coming toward us. He's coming toward us, and all that just to kind of set the scene for John chapter 9, because that's sort of what you get with John chapter 9. I mean, Jesus has had a terrible day. He has been accosted by so many people. At some point, they've sent people to arrest him. Now, they came back empty-handed, but Jesus, he's God in the flesh. He knows that they have sent people to arrest him. He's been dealing with this situation where they bring him a woman taken in adultery. Do you think sin grieves the heart of God? Sometimes we make that all about the stoning. Should they stone her? Should they not? Sin grieves the heart of God. Here's a child of his that all they're concerned about is what Jesus is going to say and trying to trip Jesus up and entrap him. And Jesus sees a soul who's sinned. And there's another soul involved there, and he's concerned about that man as well. Whether he was among that crowd or not, we don't know. But there was that situation, and to add grief upon grief, all they want to do is make it about what Jesus is going to say and trying to get him in trouble. So then they're constantly and really ramping up things like, oh, well, we're not born of fornication, accusing him of being born of fornication, and very blatantly denying the virgin birth. And then when you get to chapter 9, he comes across this blind man. And, sometimes these folks will sit there, and you'll see this in Acts chapter 3, where there's a man sat at the gate beautiful. Peter's going to heal him. He was lame, not blind, but this would happen sometimes. They would sit there, and especially during a feast time, because it's kind of like in Atlanta. They position themselves a lot of times at the end of those on-ramps or the interchanges between interstates, because they know lots of people are going to come through there. I was sort of laughing on the way to Last Leaders, not laughing like making fun or whatever, but that interchange where you're going from I-20 to 75, 85 in the downtown area, I don't care what time of day you go through there. I literally came through there like years ago. I think it was 2014 when I went up to Brother David and Sheila Wilson's, David Wilson and Sheila's place up in Tennessee, and preached a meeting at the little congregation up there. Well, I don't know if y'all remember that. Some of the folks had been here for a while, but I had Noah and Rachel with me, little Noah, little Rachel, and it was just one of those trips where like everything was going wrong. Blew a tire on the way up there, just all these different things. And so by Thursday night, the last night of the meeting, I told Brother David, I said, David, I'm going to drive home after the meeting. He said, Chad, that's like 4 hours or more. I said, I know, but I got a lot to do tomorrow to get ready for Sunday. I want to sleep in my own bed. I'd rather have just a few hours sleep in my own bed, and it's just better. And I said, plus, maybe I'll make good time through Atlanta, because I'll be hitting Atlanta so late by the time I get out of the meeting and change clothes. Well, sure enough, I hit Atlanta. I think it was like 2 a.m. by the time I got on the road. Might have been more like 2:30. It's the only time that I can ever remember to this day I've ever come through Atlanta and never had to even slow down. But that exchange there, 2075, is always going to slow down. And you're always going to end up waiting. And so this last time as we went to Last Leaders, I said, well, they know what they're doing, because they know it's going to slow down. It's going to be kind of stop and go, and people are going to come through, and some folks are going to give them money. So these people, blind, lame, whatever, they would a lot of times be there at the temple, especially during times like this, because they knew a lot of people are there. And so I just, again, maybe it's just me and I'm telling on myself, but I can picture coming in after the day he's had, and you see this person and almost just be like stopping your tracks and be like, oh, let's just go the other way. Don't want to deal with this right now. I don't feel like dealing with this right now. And maybe, sometimes we just sort of roll our eyes like, ugh. But that's not Jesus' reaction at all, of course. First thing I notice here is his disciples ask him, saying, Master, who did sin, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Now, time out. What? His disciples asked him, saying, Master, who did sin? This man or his parents, that he was born blind. Now, he was born blind. They understood that. First question that comes to my mind is, how do you sin so as to be born blind? I don't know. Brother Mosier said something about this one time, and he said, it's almost like, he said, I think they had some kind of warped belief of reincarnation, maybe. I don't know, possibly. I don't know that I can say that with any kind of certainty. Maybe they just didn't think about what they were saying. Sometimes we do that too, right? But you can't sin so as to be born blind. But maybe his parents did. Maybe that's really what they had in mind. Oh, this poor guy, he's suffering because his parents sinned and now he's been born blind. It's that same old assumption, wrong assumption, that goes all the way back even to the patriarchal days, shortly after the flood in the days of Job. Here's Job, and he's suffering, and his friends come and they say, he must have done something wrong, Job. Because nobody suffers unless they've done something wrong. Somebody has done something wrong. Of course, that's the bulk of what the book of Job deals with, is that no, that's not always the case. And we've looked at lessons before and talked about, well, why do people suffer? Why do bad things happen in this world? Ultimately, we live in a fallen world, and that's kind of the shortest answer. But there are a lot of different reasons that we gave, even in that lesson. We've looked at that numerous times, but sometimes we just don't know. That's what's interesting to me is when you get to the book of Job, I believe Job wrote the book of Job, but assuming he did, he never knew the reason until he wrote the book. It's not like God when you get to the end of all that and God says, he's kind of wrapping up things there, and God blesses him doubly than beyond what he had before. God never says, okay, now Job, let me explain to you what's been going on here. No indication he knew until he wrote the book, if in fact he did write that book. So sometimes we just don't know. And that's an exercise in faith, an exercise in trusting our Father. It's not a blind trust. We've got evidence that lets us know that we have every reason to trust our Father, but sometimes we just don't know. So they want to know who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind. They got that same assumption that Job's friends, so-called friends, had. Jesus just flatly answers them. Neither had this man sinned nor his parents, but that the works of God should be made manifest in him. He says, I must work the works of him that sent me while it is day. The night cometh when no man can work. As long as I'm in the world, I'm the light of the world. And when he had thus spoken, he spat on the ground, made clay of the spittle, and anointed the eyes of the blind man with the clay. Then he tells him, go wash in the pool of Siloam, which is, by interpretation, sent. He went his way, therefore, and washed and came seeing. Well, boy, this is a good thing. Jesus here, he's had a bad day. He comes across this fellow, and the first thing his disciples want to know is, well, who sinned that he was born blind? And, you can almost just see Jesus. He's just, again, it's been a tough day. He's just kind of like, nobody's saying that he was born blind. But the works of God are going to be shown in him. And so the guy, no doubt, at this point is probably going, hey, guys, can you give some change? Can you give me some money? And so Jesus, he anoints his eyes and he says, go to the pool of Siloam and wash. I believe, I meant to look this up and I forgot, but I think I think you can look it up and see. But I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that archaeologists have discovered what they believe, maybe even have confirmed, is the pool of Siloam over in Palestine. But so Jesus sends him, and the guy's healed. And, that's wonderful. You would think, right? It's certainly wonderful to that guy who was healed. Jesus, no doubt, feels better because, again, this is a soul, and he's helped a soul. But here's the thing. Verse 8 says, the neighbors, therefore, and they which before had seen him that he was blind, said, Is not this he that sat and begged? And, spoiler alert, Jesus' bad day is about to get worse. It's not over yet. Some said, this is he. Others said, he is like him. But he said, the formerly blind man says, I am he, is the way the King James adds that italicized word, he. Therefore said they unto him, how are thine eyes open? Wait, this is the guy that was, and you could just hear people whispering, and look, isn't that the guy that always sits at the gate? That's the blind guy. Remember we talked to him last week? You gave him some money. No. It looks like him, but it's not. We've been there, right? You've done this before. We were watching something last night, and some actor in a television show, and I said, oh, that's the guy that's in whatever. And Levi and Rachel were in there. He said, no, that's not him. I said, yeah, I think it is. And, of course, Rachel gets on her phone, looks at him, and she's like, here's that guy. Oh, yeah, it's not him. But she said, I can see he does kind of look like him. We do that sometimes. So people are kind of debating, I think it's him. Nah, I think it looks like him, but I don't think so. Finally, they ask him, and he says, yeah, I'm that guy. So, of course, that's the question everybody wants to know. You've been blind since you were born. How do you see? What happened? How were thine eyes opened? Verse 10 says, he answered, said, a man is called Jesus made clay and anointed mine eyes and said unto me, go to the pool of Siloam and wash. And I went and washed, and I received sight. So now they say, you can just see some of these folks, maybe not all of them, because some of them might be curious, some of them might even be believers, but when they hear him say a man that is called Jesus. Now, there's no indication he knows a whole lot about Jesus at this point, because, in fact, he even says, here in the South, we might say, this fella named Jesus. He says, a man that is called Jesus did this. And can't you just imagine some of those folks, when they hear that name, they go, him again. So they say, well, you can almost see them kind of erase that disgust and say, well, now, and pretend to be genuinely interested. Where is he? So they ask where he is, and, well, he says, I don't know, verse 12. I know not. Then they brought to the Pharisees him that aforetime was blind. I don't really know what their purpose is here, bringing him to the Pharisees. Maybe it's just to sort of say, look what he's done now, which is ironic if so, because look what he's done now. Yeah, look what he's done now. This guy was born blind. I wish I could remember the discussion I had with Dr. Berry years ago. I actually was kind of listening in, and then he sort of caught me up. But it was really fascinating. He was explaining about, it's one thing if you can help somebody who has gone blind. But someone who was born blind has never had that ability. It's like, it's almost like we would kind of say like an Uber miracle. I don't know if there's such a thing, but it's even more impressive. I don't know, Ken, did you ever have that conversation with? I wish I could remember that. I need to get with him and see if he can remember what that was. But it was. I just sat there and listened. He was talking to somebody else, and 2 or 3 people kind of gathered around because he's an ophthalmologist, and it was really, really interesting. But if in fact they brought him, and we don't know for sure why, but if they brought him to the Pharisees just to kind of be like, look what he did now, then it's like, yeah, look what he did. But they're not happy about it. They never are. It's just so amazing to me. So they bring him to the Pharisees, verse 14, and it was the Sabbath day when Jesus made the clay and opened his eyes. Here we go. Now we understand. Maybe they brought him just for the simple point of saying, he's done it again. Healed somebody on the Sabbath day. Look here, remember this guy? Always begging at the gate, asking for money, blind. Yeah, I remember that guy. This is him. He sees now. Says a man named Jesus. And anointed his eyes, told him to go wash the pool of Siloam. He's broken the Sabbath again. What are we going to do about this? I mean, you can just hear the conversation. So, now they got the Pharisees' attention. So they asked, verse 15, how he had received his sight. And he said, well, he put clay on my eyes, and I washed and do see. You're going to notice something, by the way, with this fella that was healed. He's going to get kind of tired of telling this story. I mean, he tells it way more times than he wants to because everybody keeps asking him about it. And they're just, it's like they're not listening. He put clay upon mine eyes, and I washed and do see. Therefore said some of the Pharisees, oh, this man is not of God. Talking about Jesus, of course. This man is not of God, because he keepeth not the Sabbath day. Others said, this is kind of the logical response here, how can a man that is a sinner do such miracles? And there was a division among them. Well, even among the Pharisees, there's a division. Now, did Jesus break the Sabbath day? No. Well, we've already established that looking at other instances where he healed someone on Sabbath day. It's not like it was work. And it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. Jesus says that, Matthew 12. Oh, that goes back to some of our previous questions. I think I've got that somewhere in here. But anyways, it's in Matthew 12 somewhere. If you read Matthew 12, you'll run into it, I promise. But maybe not. But he'd already established it's lawful to do good on the Sabbath. And he even points out, well, do you not lead your animal to water him on the Sabbath? You just let them sit there and thirst to death because it's the Sabbath. No, you take them, you lead them to water. If they fall into some kind of a ditch or a cistern, a hole, something, do you just leave them and go, oh, well, I really hate that. It looks like sounds like he's suffering, but, I mean, it's the Sabbath. No, you get them out. And that's a lot of work. If it's an ox or a donkey that falls in, yeah, you better believe that's work. But is that violating the Sabbath? No. He says if a man-child is born and the 8th day falls on the Sabbath, you still circumcise him. So, they were being dishonest with that law. They had their traditions, of course, and that their traditions, and that was their problem. Their traditions were more important to them than the law of God. So, they ask him, he tells them, they say, oh, he's not of God. But then some of them are standing up and going like, hang on. I mean, yeah, we got our Sabbath traditions and all this, but how is a guy who is a sinner and you say is violating the Sabbath regularly, how does he do these miracles? I mean, at least some of them had enough sense to ask that question. So there's this division. So now they ask the blind man. And a lot of times, rather than be honest with themselves and destroy their cronyism, sometimes they'll turn on a third party, and you watch it. They say unto the blind man again, what sayest thou of him, that he hath opened thine eyes? He said, well, you can just almost see this guy sitting there going like, well, seems to me he's some kind of a prophet. Now, I don't know how much this guy knows as far as the Old Testament scriptures and things like that. I know he's not been reading the scriptures, because how do we know that? Well, up until just a few minutes ago, he was blind, right? I know he hasn't been reading them. That doesn't mean he hadn't been hearing. Maybe some people have been reading to him. I don't know. Maybe he's been so busy trying to get alms and things like that he may be extremely ignorant of the scriptures. But he does have enough sense to say, well, he's got to be some kind of a prophet. But the Jews did not believe concerning him that he had been blind. Now they start to see, I told you, they got to turn on this third party. And they had not believed that he'd been blind and received his sight until they called the parents of him that had received his sight. So you could almost say, what do you think about him? Well, it seems to me he's some kind of a prophet. How do we even know you were really blind? And you just sort of want to say, if you're that guy, like, are you serious? Do you think I've just been faking all these years? I've just been walking around pretending I was blind? Like, come on, man. But they get his parents. They bring his parents there. Probably they were there for the feast anyways. They asked them, saying, watch how they say this. Is this your son, who ye say was born blind? How then doth he now see? Is this your boy that you claim was born blind? Oh, his parents, though, they're careful with this. Now again, I've pointed this out before. I won't rehash all of it, but it's very difficult for us to appreciate fully what a devastating thing for them in their culture it is to be kicked out of the synagogue, or in this case, the temple, to be the outcast, blacklisted, pariah. We might, a lot of times nowadays somebody says, the church kicked me out. Well, I don't care. I'm just going down the road. Or, I got my buddies from work, whatever. And so sometimes it just doesn't have the desired effect. Sometimes that's on us because we don't have the relationships that God desires for us to have with our brethren. And so it really doesn't matter to us. And if I'm not faithful to the church, well, if the elders withdraw from me, it's kind of like, so what? That's not to say we shouldn't do it. The Bible still teaches us to do it. But if I get withdrawn from and I'm not faithful, I don't have any kind of connections, I'm just sort of like, all right. I may get mad about it or something, but it doesn't really seem to affect me. If I'm not active, maybe I'm attending to sort of soothe my conscience, but I'm not really involved, not really connected, and I get withdrawn from, does it really affect me? Again, it's still the right thing to do, but it just doesn't have, and so for it to have the desired effect, and sometimes people say, well, it doesn't work. Well, it does work. It works in the form of we're obeying God, but it also works when there's that connection there that God desires us to have. But for them, you get kicked out of the synagogue, you get kicked out of the temple, banned, shunned. Oh, I mean, that was their life. And so his parents are very careful how they answer this. And so they say, look, we can tell you this is our son. And we can tell you he was born blind. But by what means he now seeth, we know not. Who hath opened his eyes, we know not. Look, he is of age. They say, well, he's of age, ask him, he shall speak for himself. Now, to sort of paraphrase that, they say, look, we know this is our boy. We know he was born blind. What happened? I don't know. Who did this? I don't know. And they essentially say, paraphrasing it, they say, he's a big boy. Why don't you just ask him? And that's, of course, John gives us an inspired commentary, verse 22. These words spake his parents because they feared the Jews. For the Jews had agreed already that if any man did confess that he was the Christ, he should be put out of the synagogue. Well, they say, he's a big boy. I think it'd be best if you just ask him. I mean, let him speak on his own behalf. You can sort of see them couching this in very careful words so that they don't get in trouble, which is kind of, I don't know. I read this, and that kind of is sad to me because they're his parents. And he's not backing down. Give him credit. I mean, he knows what happened. And he has no issue telling them, and he tells them multiple times, I was blind. A man named Jesus came along. He anointed my eyes, and now I'm seeing. And he must be some kind of prophet to do that, at the least. But his parents are kind of like, better just ask him. And they kind of throw him under the bus, don't they? It just troubles me a little bit. Therefore said his parents, he's of age, ask him. Verse 23. Then again they called the man that was blind and said unto him, give God the praise. We know that this man is a sinner. Now what they're doing here is they're trying to intimidate him. This is, I don't have Bob in here, so I have to trust my memory. Scott, maybe you remember. I don't know. Did you ever take logic at the school? Is it poisoning the well? Is kind of the common term, I think, here when you say something that, in legal terms, sometimes you'll hear an objection and they'll say leading the witness. You're trying to lead them toward a certain answer, and it's very obvious here what they're kind of making it very clear to this fella. You're about to be in serious trouble. You don't want to go down this road of saying he's a prophet, son. So, give God the praise. We know this man is a sinner. And perhaps even they're not upset. Maybe they're very calm and saying to him, now, mister, you give God the praise. We know that this man is a sinner. He answers, verse 25, the formerly blind man. Whether he be a sinner or no, I know not. One thing I know. Tell you what I do know, he says. I was blind, and now I can see. That's about as simple as it gets, isn't it? He says, listen, you can talk all day long about your your little Sabbath traditions and all that you got attached to the Sabbath. But let me tell you what I know. I was blind as a bat, we sometimes say, as an expression today. I was blind as a bat, and now I see clearly. That's what I know. Don't you know that had to upset him? And buddy, they said to him again, well, what did he do? How did he open your eyes? And maybe they're trying to lead him into this whole breaking the Sabbath argument. Well, he's had enough here. This poor fellow, I mean, what did he do here? All he did was just sitting there, was blind. And he was healed. This should have been a great thing. This should have been like being published abroad, like, this is the Messiah. Here's one more evidence. This is the Messiah. And it's coming to this big controversy. He answered, verse 27, I've told you already and you didn't hear. Wherefore would you hear it again? Are you going to be his disciples? Oh, that got him. That stung him. He says, I've already told you this so many times. Why do you want to hear it again? You love it. Tell me the old story again. You want to hear this again? You thinking about being his disciple? Ooh, man. I can just hear how upset they were. Verse 28 says, then they reviled him. Now they're really fired up. And they said, thou art his disciple. We are Moses' disciples. Well, Jesus had already dealt with that in chapter 8. We know that God spake unto Moses, as for this fellow, we know not from whence he is. And look, man, the most courageous guy in this account is the formerly blind man. His parents throw him under the bus. The religious leaders, they don't know beans. They're just being dishonest. This guy is the one that's the voice of reason. And so he says, well, they say, well, this, God spake for Moses. As for this fellow, we don't know from whence he is. The man says, verse 30, why? Herein is a marvelous thing, that you know not from whence he is, and yet he hath opened my eyes. Since the world began, was it not heard that any man opened the eyes of one that was born blind? If this man were not of God, he could do nothing. Isn't that interesting? I think I just skipped a verse, didn't I? Now we know that God, verse 31, now we know that God heareth not sinners, but if any man be a worshiper of God and doeth his will, him he heareth. So here he is again. He's the voice of reason. He says, now, isn't this strange? Isn't this amazing? You don't know from where he is, and yet he just healed a man who was born blind. What's the implication there? He's saying, I know where he's from. It's kind of obvious. This guy's from heaven. Then he even backs that up by saying, we know. God's not listening. If a man says, if a man is a sinful, evil, wicked person, and he says, I call upon the power of God to heal this man of his blindness. Well, that's not going to happen. God doesn't hear sinners. But if someone's a worshiper of God and doeth his will, him he heareth. And so he says, since the world began, not heard of any man open the eyes of him that was born blind. If this man was not of God, he could not do anything. That's his conclusion. He says, guys, isn't this amazing? You say you don't know where he's from. But we know. I know, you know, everybody knows God doesn't hear sinners. This guy did the miracle. He must be of God. And look out. They answered and said, you were altogether born in sin, and you're going to teach us? How dare you? What they mean is, how dare you not say exactly what we want you to say? What are the last words there? They cast him out. And man, this is not just about the miracle. This is not just about the confrontation with Jesus. There's compassion. There is compassion here, because Jesus is going to go find this man. And he's going to ask him, do you believe on the Son of God? Now, there's our context. We'll answer that, look at the rest of the context, and see what we can